Hi everyone, this is the poem, this is analysis of the poem Remains by Simon Armitage that was written in 2008. Today's video lesson, we're going to look at what a soldier is and what our expectations are of soldiers. We're then going to look at the context of the poem Remains, why it was written and what PTSD is. We're then going to look at what the poem is about, and then we're going to read and analyse the poem in detail. Then at the end, we're going to look at 3 key quotes which can be used in your comparative essays when the time comes for you to be writing those. So the first task, it's only a 5-minute task, but I really would like you to stop and think about what a soldier is and what our expectations of soldiers are. What are the connotations, what are the associations that we make when we think of the word soldier? Okay, I have put some ideas on the screen to help you. So why might a person choose to join the armed services? What events might they experience? What impact might this have on them? And what difficulties might they face? So what I'd like you to do is pause the video for 5 minutes and have a real think about what a soldier is to you. We're now going to look at the context of the poem Remains. So as I mentioned, Simon Armitage wrote the poem in 2008, and what he did was he interviewed some veteran soldiers from different wars. And a veteran soldier just means a soldier that no longer serves in the armed forces. And from these interviews, he then wrote a collection of poems that he called The Not Dead. And this was also a documentary that was put out on Channel 4 a few years ago. And if you search YouTube for the Not Dead documentary, you can watch that documentary on YouTube now. It's got the actual interview with the man that remains, with the man that the story of Remains is based on. Each poem focuses on a flashback that a soldier has struggled to forget. And as I've said, Simon Armitage interviews the soldier and then writes a poem imagining that he is that soldier. And Remains was based on a soldier called Guardsman Tromans who served in the Iraq War in 2003. The war actually lasted between 2003 and 2011. However, Guardsman Tromans only served in 2003, and the poem explains why that is. Now, this is a picture of Guardsman Tromans, and he was a machine gunner in the Iraq War. And as I've mentioned, Simon Armitage wrote a poem pretending to be him in a moment in Iraq, and the poem that he writes is the poem that we're going to look at in the rest of this video lesson. If at any point you would like to write any of this down, just pause the video and make sure that you've got these notes written down. So for those of you that don't know, post-traumatic stress disorder is an anxiety disorder that's caused by a very traumatic, frightening or distressing event. And someone with PTSD will often relive that traumatic event through nightmares, flashbacks. They may well experience feelings of isolation and guilt. And very often, a person that suffers with PTSD is a very different person after this event to what they were before the event. And this means that they often need a lot of help and support to deal with their emotions and to get through the terrible ordeal that has happened to them. So looking at the poem Remains, as I mentioned, it's a poem that's written by Simon Armitage, but it's based on a true story of Guardsman Tromans during the Iraq War. And Tromans describes how the soldiers in Iraq were instructed to go and protect a bank that was being looted. It was being robbed. And when they arrived, a man ran out and the soldiers shot him, or Tromans shot him. And Tromans then carried on doing his job, and he entered the bank to help try and stop the looters. Afterwards, he was on the roof of the bank and he saw the man that he'd shot still crying out in pain on the road below. The man then died, and Tromans watched a lorry come along, pick the dead body up, throw it on the back of the lorry and drive away. And watching the body of somebody that he had killed being taken away caused him great stress. And this stress led to him leaving the army, going through a period of committing crimes and struggling a lot with his emotions. And then ultimately he was diagnosed with PTSD, and he did get the help that he needed. So the poem is about the effects of war, and it really is about those indescribable effects of war on soldiers, on men, even sometimes years later after the event. So we are now going to read through the poem. So what I'm going to ask you to do, because I'm going to read the poem, give you some information, and then there's going to be some questions that will come up in red about each stanza. So once I've given you the information, I need you to pause the video and answer the questions in red, and then it should give you a detailed understanding of the poem. So stanza 1, on another occasion we got sent out to tackle looters that were raiding a bank, and one of them legs it up the road, probably armed, but possibly not. So for instance, on another occasion implies that this is not the first time that these soldiers had been given this kind of a task to do. Okay, so why is that significant? What effect may this have had on the soldiers that they had to do this kind of thing over and over again? I've also noted that there is some enjambment there on we got sent out to tackle the looters. Remember, enjambment is when there's no punctuation at the end of the line. So we got sent out to tackle the looters. What effect does this have on the tone of the poem? Okay, there's no pause to it. Think about the idea that this is a real life story. Also, there's lots of colloquial language, informal language. One of them legs it up the road. Why is that important in this poem, to use informal language? And then the very last line there is probably armed, possibly not. It's a very crucial line. It's actually repeated again later on in the poem. What might his thought process here later lead to for this soldier? Okay, think about the idea that this man was possibly not armed. So this man was possibly didn't have a gun on him that Troman shot dead. Okay, so I'd like you to pause the video, please, and answer those questions in red. Stanza 2. Well, myself and somebody else are all of the same mind. So all three of us open fire, three of a kind, all letting fly, and I swear. Okay, so here we've got the idea of 3 versus 1. Does that seem like it's a fair fight? Okay, do you think this plays on Troman's mind, that there were 3 of them all shooting at this one man? So myself and somebody else, there's a repetition of the word somebody there. And this idea could be the idea that the soldiers, they don't see themselves as individuals anymore. Okay, they are part of a group, they're part of an army. Do you think that makes it easier to shoot somebody? And if so, why? Also, all 3 of us open fire. It conveys the idea that these soldiers were all trained to do the same thing at the same time in the same way. So all 3 of us open fire on this man that's ran out of the bank. Does that make it easier? Does this make soldiers behave in ways that they wouldn't behave if they were acting on their own? Do you think acting in a group in a trained manner might be different to how somebody might act on their own? And what do you think the effect is for that individual soldier that has that ends up killing somebody? Stanza 3. I see every round as it rips through his life. I see broad daylight on the other side. So we've hit this looter a dozen times and he's there on the ground, sort of inside out. So again, there's some information and some questions for you to have a look at. Stanza 4. Pain itself is the image of agony. One of my mates goes by and tosses his guts back into his body and he's carted off on the back of a lorry. So again, same idea. If we go through the ideas in blue and then you answer the questions in red. Again, there is some colloquial language. He tosses his guts back into his body. So you see that image, it's that real imagery and image of a soldier coming along, tossing somebody's guts back into the body, putting them on the back of a lorry. Okay, paying no respect to the fact that this person is a dead person. The image of agony, emotive language. How does this show how Troman's the soldier feels? He's watching somebody on the floor and he is the image of agony, and it's somebody that he has shot. We've also there look at the keyword of the verb tosses, and this implies that the looter's life is worthless. Could this be what the soldier is struggling with? Stanza 5, end of story, except not really. His blood shadow stays on the street, And out on patrol, I walk right over it week after week. Then I'm home on leave, but I blink. So there's a lot to talk about in this stanza. His blood shadow, that is a metaphor which conveys the feelings of guilt that Tromans is feeling, because on the next day and the day after this shooting and weeks after this shooting, when he's still in Iraq, he has to walk around that bank, he has to walk along those streets, and he still sees that dead body. He thinks it's there still on the street, okay? Because he's out on patrol and he walks over it week after week. So that's a metaphor. He doesn't actually walk over it, but he still sees that image of the man dying on the floor. End of story, except not really. Now that is a key quote as well, because except not really, what does that show that the soldier has struggled with since the shooting? So he's kind of saying there that should have been the end of the story. He came, he saw some danger, he shot at the man, which is that was what he was sent to do. So that should have been the end of the story, except not really. It wasn't the end of the story for Guardsman Tromans. It may have been for the other two soldiers involved, but not for Tromans. Okay, so what do you think he's struggled with? We've got some caesura at the end on the last line there of this stanza. So remember, caesura is where there's punctuation in the middle of the line. What could that caesura, that break, what could that represent? One idea is it could represent the idea of a life being cut short of the person that they've shot dead. So again, if you can pause at the end, pause and analyse this stanza 5, please, answering the questions in red. Stanza 6, and he bursts again through the doors of the bank. Sleep, and he's probably armed and possibly not. Dream, and he's torn apart by a dozen rounds. The drink and the drugs won't flush him out. So he bursts again through the doors of the bank. So that's in Troman's mind. That's in his dreams or in his nightmares. He sees himself still at this event in Iraq. He bursts again through the doors of the bank. Sleep, and he's probably armed and possibly not. So we spoke about probably armed and possibly not in stanza 1. That's the idea that is what's playing on Troman's mind. That he thought he was probably armed and therefore was going to show some danger, so they shot at him before he could shoot them. But there is this idea that he was possibly not armed, and that's what's playing on Troman's mind all these years later. So is that a sign of his PTSD? And the fact that sleep and dream, okay, what might this show about the state of mind of the soldier? Do you think that he's sleeping well, and what is he dreaming about all these years later? Stanza 7, he's here in my head when I close my eyes, dug in behind enemy lines, not left for dead in some distant sun-stunned, sand-smothered land, or 6 feet under in the desert sand. So we've got sibilants there, some distant sun-stunned, sand-smothered. So we've got a lot of S-sounding words. So what does that hissing sound of S represent? What do we often associate with a hissing sound? What connotations does that have? And how might this link to how the soldier feels about what he has done? He's here in my head when I close my eyes. Okay, we need to think about what does this show about how much the soldier has struggled with his time at war. So all these years later, he's still there in Troman's mind. He's still there when he closes his eyes because he's suffering with post-traumatic stress disorder. And the last stanza, but near to the knuckle in the here and the now, his bloody life is in my bloody hands. So we've got repetition there of bloody, which creates a graphic imagery. And then the last question, does the end of the poem show any sign that things may get any better for the soldier, for Tromans? Okay, he's still thinking about his bloody life is in my bloody hands. So what does that suggest about moving forward for Tromans? Do you think this is something he's going to always suffer with? Do you think this is something that he's always going to think about? The last thing we're going to do, we're just going to look at 3 key quotes, okay? So the first one is probably armed and possibly not. So as I mentioned, that is repeated. So repeated line in stanza 1 and stanza 6. So what does this line alone suggest about how the soldier felt about shooting the man? So we've spoken about this during our analysis. It's the idea that he thought he was probably armed and therefore probably posing some danger to him and his two the other two soldiers. But it's the idea of possibly not. Okay, that's what plays on Troman's mind all these years later, that he was possibly not, and therefore the looter wouldn't have posed them any danger and they didn't need to be shot. The harsh plosive sound of the P, probably armed, possibly not. What could that represent? Okay, so it could represent the harshness of war. It could represent the idea that all these years later, Troman still feels really, really badly for what he has done to this man, for taking this man's life. Why do you think that this phrase is repeated in the poem, and what does that suggest? So probably armed and possibly not. Repeated to show the PTSD that Troman is suffering with. Okay, is this idea over and over again? He was probably armed, but he was possibly not armed, and that's really what plays on Troman's mind. And the adverb probably shows that he would like to think that this man he shot was armed, but the idea that he possibly wasn't is what he struggles with still to this day. The next quote, and he tosses his guts back into his body. So tosses and guts is colloquial language showing that this is very normal practice. The men collecting the body show no remorse at collecting a dead body off the ground. Does that perhaps show how many dead bodies and shootings were happening at the time? There's also a clear imagery being used here. It's a clear image shown, and also the image is exactly what Guardsman Troman saw from the roof of the bank. So it's imagery in the reader's mind, but it's also the exact image that Troman saw, which he still struggles with to this day. That somebody came along, another soldier came along to collect the dead bodies, he tossed his guts back into his body and put him on the back of a lorry. Okay, and that's the image that Troman struggles with all these years later. There's also enjambment being used here from the previous line, showing that, which could possibly show that the war is ongoing. Okay, the war carried on even after Troman's went home. It also could show that the soldier's pain is ongoing. Okay, so the soldier thought that possibly once he went home that he would be okay when he wasn't reminded every day of what he'd done, but that wasn't the case because this pain is ongoing even whilst he's back home. The enjambment could also show that the image is ongoing in Troman's mind, and the fact that he will soon have to go out and shoot another person suggests that the shootings are ongoing, that the war is ongoing, that this would have been something that Troman would have had to have done over and over again, and obviously something that Troman himself admits that he really struggled with. And the last key quote, end of story except not really. And I feel like this really highlights the PTSD that Troman is suffering with. So end of story, that should have been the end. Okay, he thought that this man was posing a danger to him and his two soldiers, so they shot at him as they are trained to do. That should have been the end of the story. And then we've got some caesura used there in the middle because it says except not really. So this wasn't the end of the story for Troman's. So the idea that the pain didn't stop when Troman's got back to England, his suffering is ongoing. Perhaps he left the army as he thought Iraq was giving him those awful memories, but in fact leaving the army didn't help. It should have been the end of the story, but unfortunately for him, it wasn't.